Hello, welcome back to the Fruit of Grisaia. I am now slowly getting traumatized. Captain Sakashita scooped some gruel out of the Sierra cup in her hand and pushed the spoon forward, but Hiroka-san bit her lower lip and turned her face aside, rejecting the food outright.
食べたくないんです。そんなはずはないでしょ。まずいから食べたくないなんてわがままが許される状況じゃないのは説明したはずです。食べなさい。
I myself had nursed Hiroka-san numerous times over the last week. She'd never accepted much in the way of food, but the last few days in particular, she hadn't eaten anything remotely approaching a meal. With both legs broken, she was almost entirely unable to move. Spending all day lying down would probably tend to reduce your appetite. And when you happen to be lying down in a confined space reeking of pus and dirt and sweat, hunger pangs might well be less of a problem than containing your nausea. The high fever from her fractures lasted 3 days, during which we were forced to keep her on a purely liquid diet. Even after her temperature fell, the most she could keep down was a light rice gruel with practically no added ingredients, and even that watery broth she sipped very slowly, and in small quantities.
お願いします。もう許してください。
Hiroka-san grated out the words through gritted teeth, her contorted expression begging for a reprieve. As she squeezed her eyes shut, small tears spilled from the corners of her eyes.
許してって何よ。人聞きの悪いことを言わないで。まるで私があなたをいじめているようじゃない。
The captain jerked back the spoon and noisily slammed the aluminum cup to the floor in obvious irritation. The porridge inside was surprisingly thick with rice. Unlike our typical watered-down wheat soups, it was a legitimate gruel. Compared to the relatively healthy members of the group, the wounded needed more nourishment to help their bodies heal. They must have been receiving preferential rations. At a quick glance, there seemed to be as much rice in that one bowl as I received in a single day.
むしろあなたは感謝するべき立場なのよ。それがどうしてそんな口の利き方ができるというの？
Why do you think we're giving special treatment to invalids who can't even work? But before the next angry words in the sequence could spill out of Captain Sakashita's mouth, Kazuki, who had been silently cleaning Sakurai's stomach wound the whole time, finally interjected.
人が嫌がっていることを無理強いするのがいじめ以外の何だと言うんです？
Captain Sakashita turned to face Kazuki's back, glaring so fiercely I half expected her to pop a blood vessel.
今の私たちにとってこの一握りのお米がどれだけ貴重かあなたにだって分かっているでしょ？
ええ、もちろん。でもあなたは間違っています。
If Kazuki noticed the captain's furious glare, she gave no sign of it, not even bothering to turn around. She continued treating Sakurai as she spoke.
こんな状況だからこそ力強くも絶対的な存在として甘い顔はできないと考えたのかもしれませんが、弱者を相手にいい人ごっこをしている姿を主張したいのなら少しは他者を思いやる姿勢を見せてはいかがですか？
それはあなたのようにずる賢くやってみせろと？
そう、私のようにずる賢くです。おつむが弱い分、どうしても力押しに頼るのはあなたの悪い癖です。
Oh, God, stop it, Kazuki. The tent was unpleasantly humid enough to begin with. I really could have done without the nasty cold sweat now drenching my back.
ここはもう結構ですから、ご自分のテントにお戻りになられてはいかがです？
あなたには後でお話があります。 私のテントまで来ていただける？
まあ怖い。とても一人では訪ねる勇気がないので、アマネを同行させても？
構わないわ。
As she spat out those words, Captain Sakashika's dark, angry eyes flashed over to settle on me. Don't get me mixed up in this. Do not get me mixed up in this, Kazuki. Pierced by the captain's loathing glare, I stiffened in the entrance of the tent like a rock, managing to respond only with a terrified gulp. Maybe she realized how awkward I felt about the whole thing. Maybe not. Either way, Captain Sakashita gave a little snort, then pushed right past me and out of the tent.
カズキなーに？情けない声を出さないでちょうだい。それより薬草はどうしたの？積んできたけど。
I quickly opened the mess kit I'd been carrying. At some point, the snails I captured had glued themselves to the opposite side of the lid.
ありがとう。
Kazuki grabbed a number of chameleon plant leaves from the aluminum cooker, crumpled them in her hand, and deftly began to apply them to the area around Sakurai's wound.
少し染みますか？
少しだけ。でもかゆいよりは痛い方がまだいいわ。
薬草を積んできたのはアマネです。
スオさん、ありがとう。
いえ、どういたしまして。
Sakurai senpai was as placid and soft-spoken as always. Even in the fairly tomboyish basketball team, she'd been generally admired as the greatest beauty in the group. I didn't know the exact details, but apparently her father was a famous stage actor, and her mother a former idol singer. Born to suit two such people, it was perhaps unsurprising that she turned out as lovely as she did. Against such a contrast, the ugly, jagged wound across her abdomen and its crude stitches were all the more painful to look at.
はい、終わりましたよ。テントの外に出て日に当たってください。
This is
お
so
世話になり
unsettling.
ました。
The presence of the wound must still have been a source of unease, if not discomfort, to her. As Sakurai slowly rose from the ground, her hands softly traced the gash from above the freshly applied bandages. With a brief polite bow to Kazuki, she quietly crawled out of the tent.
こんな状況でも美人なんだね、桜井先輩。そのこと、あまり本人の前では言わない方がいいわね。彼女、演技も下手だし、歌も苦手で、自分には容姿以外の取り柄がないって思っているみたいだから、褒めたつもりでも、結果的に彼女を追い詰めることになりかねないわ。そうなんだ。
In that case, the ugly wound to her stomach must have been a considerable psychological shock. I turned around to peer out the open flap of the tent. As Sakurai slowly walked off into the distance, her shoulders seemed to be sagging.
金田さんのように顔の怪我じゃなかっただけ幸運だと思わなければね。
To be sure, that would have been even harder on her. But Kaneda herself didn't seem particularly depressed. Maybe she was just counting herself lucky to have survived. I suppose she might just have been the sort not to sweat the small stuff. She didn't whine about the gash on her head, but by the same token, she wouldn't come to have the wound treated unless we called for her.
今はそんなことより、広岡さん。なかなか気がついてあげられなくてごめんなさい。
なんのことですか？
あなたが食事を取りたがらない理由よ。
As she spoke, Kazuki reached out for the zipper of Hiroka-san's tightly closed sleeping bag.
待って、お願い、いや。
恥ずかしいのはわかるけど、このままにはしておけないでしょ。
Kazuki's voice was far more gentle than I'd ever heard it before. Nonetheless, Hiruka-san broke into painful, bitter sobs, like a child begging for forgiveness. She turned her head to the side, her gaze coming to rest on me. There were fat teardrops rolling down her cheeks.
あまね、悪いけどお湯を沸かしてきてくれる？
どれぐらい？
バケツ1杯分。急がないでいいわ。お願い。
わかった。
As I turned to leave, a sharp new smell cut through the stuffy air of the tent, and I finally understood the situation. Hiruka-san soiled herself. Right, at the moment, she couldn't even stand up on her own power. With a little maneuvering, she'd probably be able to handle a number 1 by herself, but a number 2 would absolutely require external assistance. Hiruka-san had always been the most timid and introverted member of our team. Even under the best of circumstances, she found it difficult to assert herself. She must simply have been too humiliated to ask for the help she needed. In other words, she'd been refusing food for the last few days out of sheer terror at producing waste. It all fell horribly into place in an instant. Her body racked with sobs, Hiruka-san buried her face into her hands. Kazuki spoke to her again, her voice like a comforting caress.
気にすることはないわ。生きていれば当たり前のことなのだから。
Slightly unsettled by Kazuki's uncharacteristic kindness, I hastily left the tent.
なんだよ和樹のやつ。私にはあんな優しい顔絶対しないくせにさ。
All of a sudden, there was a complex and intense mixture of feelings. Unease, irritation, anxiety, and others I couldn't quite put into words, swirling unpleasantly around my chest.
そんなに広岡が可愛いなら、あいつと付き合えばいいじゃんかよ。
Hold on a second there, yourself. What did you just say? I mean, what? You'd almost think I was jealous here or something. Well, now that I think about it, maybe I am a little jealous. But Kazuki and I are both girls, so know what exactly is going on here. Sometimes pet dogs get all cranky when they see their master doting on somebody else's mutt. Maybe this is something similar? I knew it was downright weird for me to be feeling this way, but the irritation was real, and it wasn't going away. Maybe I should just throw away my dignity to the wind and give her a nasty bite the next time she tries to give me a treat.
あなた今変なこと考えているでしょう。
何のこと？
私はあなたを一番信頼しているし、あなたに一番頼っているのは事実よ。私がどこへ行こうと結局最後にはあなたのところへ帰ってくるのだから、あなたはどっしりと構えて待っていればいいの。
何言ってるの？
わからない？私にはあなたが必要だってそう言っているのよ。あまね。なんで？ 首のところ血が出てるわ。
あ、これはヒルに噛まれて痛くないから平気だよ。
血が止まっていないじゃない。そのままにしておけば何時間も止まらないわよ。いいからいらっしゃい。
Suki reached her small arms up, drawing my head down toward her, and pressed her lips against the scruff of my neck. After briefly running her tongue along the area of the leech bite, she began to suck on the wound. Anything to survive at this point.
いや、カズキ、そんなに強く吸ったら出ちゃうよ。
全部吸い出して。 てあげるわ。
What is this? Why does she have to? Why does this have to be so pointlessly erotic? Why do they have to play this music? Kazuki's lips, they're small and soft and kind of feel nice. This isn't good. Now I'm getting in a weird mood. She sucked the blood and anticoagulant out of my neck until her mouth was full, spat it out, and came right back for more. I understood she was performing medical treatment, but every time Kazuki's lips touched me, my body quivered. Every time she exhaled through her nose, her breath tickled my cheek, and strange little noises leaked out of my mouth. In a daze, my eyes half closed, I whimpered nasally. It took a good minute for me to notice that Sakuma-senpai was standing nearby, her arms folded, taking in the whole scene with a smirk on her face.
やれやれ、随分と大胆だね、君たちも。
So she sucked the venom out of her.
違いますよ。これはそういうんじゃなくて、そう、ヒルです。私森でヒルに噛まれて、それでこれは血が止まらないから、そのカズキが。
何、別に責めているわけじゃないよ。愛情には様々な形があってしかりだと私は思っているしね。
だからこれは別に愛情とかそういうことじゃなくて治療ですよ。
治療だって愛情だろ。君、誰に何の言い訳をしているんだい？
アマネをいじめると楽しいのは理解できますけど、それはペアである私の特権です。あまりアマネをからかわないでください、佐久間先輩。
横暴だな。アマネはみんなのアマネだよ。
そう思うのは勝手ですけどね。それで私のアマネに何かご用でも？
意外と独占欲が強いな君。まあいいさ。トイレを作るんだろ。さっき部長が来て、手が空いているものがいたらアマネを手伝えって言われてきたんだよ。
助かります。
いいさ、どうせ暇だしね。することがないと落ち込むばかりだ。これは私だけかもしれないけど、体を動かしている方が苦痛を感じないし、何もしないでいる方が疲れるんだよ。というわけで、アマネを借りていくよ。悪いね、風見。
わかりました。くれぐれも大切に扱ってくださいね。
カズキ。
いいんだよ。いつもそばにいる便利な女だと思われていると苦労ばかりが増えるよ。たまには距離を置くのも悪くはないさ。ほら、行くよ。
はい。
They made that weird. The last few days, both Captain Sakashita and Mr. Ochi had been absent from the camp more often than not. They were supposedly investigating the forest, but we hadn't gotten much specific information about what that involved. With our teacher, the team's official figurehead, and the captain, its true leader, both absent, the majority of the group looked to Kazami Kazuki for orders. To be perfectly honest, there were a considerable number of people who openly scowled at the idea of accepting instructions from an arrogant, sharp-tongued freshman. But by nature, people turn to competence over formal authority in times of crisis. And it was simply a fact that our efficiency as a group increased when command of the camp passed from Captain Sakashita to Kazuki. She carefully assessed everyone's personality and skills and assigned them appropriate jobs, placing a moderate responsibility on every individual's shoulders. Through her consistent distribution of tasks, we had all naturally become aware of our roles, quickly learning to bring certain tasks to certain people without her direct intervention. She created a framework that enabled us to be productive. This toilet construction operation was a good example. Kazuki didn't stand on the sidelines directing us, but her initial planning divided us into our teams. One group dug the hole, one group repurposed a chair from the bus into a seat, and one group focused on creating a sturdy roof that wouldn't leak in heavy rain. And she designed a clear procedure for the job, with logical, easy-to-remember steps carefully tuned to compensate for our small number of workers. By following her instructions, we managed to finish the job rather quickly. The completed toilet wasn't much to look at, granted. In fact, it was unmistakably a ramshackle hut slapped together by novice carpenters, but it was functional enough. Of particular note was our makeshift septic tank, filled with gasoline extracted from the bus. As an effective countermeasure against flies, maggots, and other pests, it helped erase our concerns about creating a hub for transmitting disease. If Kazuki had been there, I doubt we could have come up with that idea, much less implemented it. Given such clear displays of competence, even those who disliked Kazuki on a personal level were growing increasingly reliant on her leadership, although in some cases only grudgingly and out of necessity. As the sun declined in the west and the fierce heat and humidity finally began to die down, I set about making wheat soup using our meager allocation of rice and the vegetables we'd been able to gather in the forest. Today, the job was far larger than it had been at first. For quite some time, every pair had carefully prepared supper for themselves, probably out of paranoia about the possibility of having some of their food snatched secretly away, but for the last few days, I'd increasingly been assuming the role of the camp cook. I went along with the new responsibility easily enough. Since I'd been preparing meals for the wounded Hiruka and Sakurai all along, increasing the quantity to feed more of the group wasn't really much of a hassle. I guess everyone finally figured, might as well just leave the cooking to the girl who grew up in a restaurant, or something. Probably another effect of Kazuki's emphasis on efficiently dividing our workload. As I struck a fire under the primitive cooking furnace we constructed from moderately sized stones, the various pairs brought forward their mess kits, offering up all the ingredients they had on hand. Apart from the small quantities of rice and vegetables distributed at the beginning of the day, each aluminum rice cooker had a range of unidentifiable weeds and wild grasses picked from the forest. Today, there were quite a number of snails as well. Surprisingly, Komori had gathered most of the small, slimy creatures in an above-average quantity, although an extremely random assortment of vegetation to boot. She'd taken her pet dog into the forest and walked a good ways in, gathering anything that seemed even vaguely edible, then found her way back to the camp without a hitch. Apparently, the dog had memorized the way back by scent. After that first success, Komori made a daily habit of approaching Kazuki with random plants that had caught her eye on such trips, asking which might be edible. When night came, our short-sleeved uniforms were, as always, inadequate protection against the chill air. Having finished our dinner, Kazuki and I set off for the large tent and half-forced Hiruka to eat. With that finished, we finally made our way to Captain Sakashi's tent, as we promised earlier in the day. She was waiting for us with Koide-senpai inside their tent, where a small candle provided some dim, flickering illumination.
Konbanwa.
Kazuki offered a polite greeting. Her tone of voice suggested she'd just arrived fashionably late to a high society gathering. Captain Sakashita responded with a curt, "There you are." Then glanced at Koide and gave a little jerk of her head, prompting her partner to leave the tent.
どうぞ入って。
Inviting us to sit with a sardonic, "Sorry, I can't offer you any tea." Captain Sakashita got right down to business before we even settled ourselves on the ground.
怪我人の様子は？
悪化はしていませんが、順調に回復しているとは言えません。
そう。
For one thing, Hiruka-san's broken legs wouldn't have fixed themselves in a few days, even under ideal circumstances. And Sakurai-senpai's abdominal wound was healing very slowly, thanks to her worsening state of malnutrition and the absence of antibiotics to fight her infection. As an added misery, the intense heat and humidity had left her with a painful skin condition. I can't take this anymore. Even the comparatively light wounded Kaneda's health needed to be monitored closely, given the poor sanitary conditions of the camp. For the last few humid days, she'd been complaining about her wound's constant itchiness. We warned her repeatedly not to scratch, but she had nonetheless picked up a troublesome habit of sticking twigs under her bandage and tearing at her stitches. And apart from those who'd been wounded in the crash, many of the healthy girls were beginning to show increasingly advanced symptoms of malnutrition. Faces were swelling noticeably as our vitamin deficiencies grew more pronounced. Some girls had begun to complain of minor ailments. To be honest, we were past the point of monitoring the situation closely. It was slowly but surely crumbling before our eyes. Captain Sakashida listened to this summary from start to finish in silence. When it was over, she again answered with a brief, "I see." After a moment, she leaned forward to look into Kazuki's face and spoke, and for a moment, I disbelieved my ears.
つまり彼女たち怪我人は無駄飯ぐらいというわけね。
それは
With this start, I realized why Captain Sakashida had driven Koide from the tent. Whatever the circumstances, she was our leader, and in speaking those words, she had just betrayed that responsibility. Maybe we'd all thought the same, in some dark corner of our mind, but no one had voiced that ugly thought, and now the captain had coolly thrown it out into the open. She understood as well as we did that a quiet, crippling pessimism regarding the food situation had begun to spread among the group. If we were to continue on these meager rations, the currently able-bodied girls would eventually be reduced to invalids. Without adequate nourishment, our physical strength would be drained, sapping us of the energy to work, and with our bodies weakened, disease would spread all too easily around the camp. Simply by existing, the wounded were acting as a heavy drain on our precious supply of food. Their presence was reducing everyone else's ration. Ultimately, this might soon give rise to more sick people, exponentially worsening the problem. When we weigh the lives of the wounded and the healthy against each other, the former will always be lighter on the scales. In this harsh environment, that pragmatic calculation felt all the more obvious. We don't have the elbow room to be handing out rations to those who can't work. The captain's argument was coherent enough, and I understood that she had little choice but to approach our situation with conservative caution. But nonetheless, her words sounded like a betrayal, a justification for unburdening ourselves of a load that had grown troublesome to carry, an excuse to abandon our friends and save ourselves.
私にずる賢く生きろと言ったのは風見さん、あなたよ。
ええ、確かに。でもずる賢く生きるのと弱者を吊るし上げて憂を晴らすのとでは意味が全然違います。
だったらあなたはその弱者の口をまかない切るだけの食料を持ち合わせているの？
いいえ、残念ながら。
口だけの綺麗事ならいくらでも言えます。あなたのいい人ごっこに付き合わされて日々体力を落とす部員たちの迷惑を少しは考えてみては？
Those spiteful words were all too clearly a deliberate act of revenge for Kazuki's insults this afternoon. Whether she was at a loss for words or simply too exasperated to speak wasn't clear, but Kazuki offered no reply other than a short, tired little sigh. I had long before decided to keep my silence and leave this conversation entirely to Kazuki, but all of a sudden I found myself unable to suppress the need to object.
それはあんまりですよ。怪我人は 餓死するまで見殺しなんですか？
そうは言っていないでしょ。
For the first time in the conversation, the captain turned to me. She'd grown gaunt in recent days, leaving her cheekbones so prominent that her eyes seemed to have sunken in her face. It made her grim gaze seem all the more severe.
配給の優先度を下げると言っただけで一切の食事を与えないわけではないわ。もちろん今後も適度な量を配給します。どうせ動けないのだからお腹もあまり減らないのでしょ。
それは違います。
There was another reason here Grisaia had refused to eat that afternoon, and with the construction of the toilet, that problem had been eliminated. We could simply help her to the toilet seat and let her relieve herself in privacy, removing the biggest psychological roadblock to her recovery.
いいのよ、アマネ。部長の言い分も決して間違いではないのよ。
でも
広岡さんには私の分の配給を分配します。それなら文句はないでしょ。
なぜ私に確認するのかしら。あなたの食料なのだからあなたが勝手にすればいいわ。
ではそうします。
Kazuki leaned forward in a very slight bow as she stood, lightly speaking the words, "Let's return," in my general direction. She abruptly left the tent.
待ってよ、カズキ。
はい、なに？
なーにじゃないよ。どうして何も言い返さないの？
言うだけ無駄だと思ったからよ。
そんなの、私はカズキのことだから絶対に食ってかかると思っていたし、いつもみたいに文句の一つも言って強引に丸め込めばよかったのに。
あなた何を言っているの？文句というのは相手の言動や態度が間違っていたり正しかったとしても気に入らない時につけるものよ。それ以外の時に口にする言葉のことは難癖というの。覚えておきなさい。
なんだよそれ。全然納得できないよ、カズキ。
言ったでしょ。部長の言っていることも間違いではないのよ。
だからって怪我人の食事を減らすなんて間違ってるよ。
だから私の食事を分けてあげるんじゃない。ノープロブレム。
全然ノープロブレムじゃないよ。忘れてるかもしれないけど、カズキだって怪我人なんだよ。
分かってるって。
何をどう分かってるっていうのさ。やっぱり今からでも部長に言って考え直してもらおうよ。こんなの間違ってるってカズキが文句を言えば絶対なんとかなるし、言うだけ言ってみようよ。
いやあね、あなたの口ぶりではまるで私が何にでも噛みつくどこかのヒステリー女みたいじゃない。私だって世の中すべての間違いに文句をつけるわけではないのよ。
そうかな。
Personally, I kind of had this image of Kazuki waving a battle flag emblazoned with the words, "We must correct the world," on some big battlefield. Then charging forth at the head of the vanguard, all Gandhi arc style, leading a glorious crusade across the mistake-riddled modern age.
私ほど間違いに寛大な女はいないわよ。考えてもごらんなさいな。私が坂下部長にあなたなぜ生まれてきたのと質問しているところを見たことがある？
ないけど。ちょっと待って。今なんかさらっとものすごいこと言わなかった？
That kind of sounded like an indirect way of implying that girl should never have been born to me.
慈悲深くも寛大な私の資料を理解できたのならさっさとテントに戻りましょう。そろそろ眠くなってきたわ。
カズキってさ、そういうとこマイペースだよね。
It was already past 9 o'clock p.m. I looked up through the trees to the sky, empty except for the bright moon and twinkling stars. The helicopter we'd seen for a few brief moments on the second day had been absent ever since. I strained my ears, but heard only the chirping of bugs. No cars running on the road above. Nothing. Why hasn't anybody noticed? There's a group of girls right down here, suffering so much. I was seized by the meaningless desire to scream for help at the moon, but I knew I'd only be making my throat hoarse. That early summer night, only the lonesome voices of insects echoed through the rocky valley. Is this almost over? The eighth day in the valley, rain fell in the night and the morning was cold. My chilled hands trembled slightly as I wrote. Come to think of it, was there even a point to keeping this diary in the first place? Thinking about it would always drain me of the will to write, but I never found an excuse to quit either. My pen moved mechanically across the pages. Fortunately, the rain had stopped before today's morning muster. Perhaps I'd become used to being drummed out of bed at the same time every morning, as recently as I was waking up naturally 15 minutes before 6. For the first few days, it had been difficult to sleep at night because of my hunger, but by now I was sleeping like a stone, and fasting at night actually seemed to make waking up in the mornings easier. That said, getting out of bed once a week was growing increasingly difficult. I had no choice but to spend 15 minutes in bed, waiting for my blood pressure to rise until I could stand up without instantly becoming lightheaded. This morning, Professor Kazami's tour of inspection proceeded as usual. The valley was shrouded in a cold, damp mist. As we made our way around the examination line, many of the girls were swaying unsteadily on their feet, their bodies still not fully awake.
おはよう、いぶきさん。今朝の体調はどうかしら？
まあ
I can't take this.
ぼちぼちです
疲れた顔をしているわね。私たちがここへ来て今日で何日目だったかしら？そう、8日目。今朝は寒いわね。昨日と比べてどっちが寒い？
昨日はそんなに寒くなかったと思うけど。
そうね。お母様はお元気？今年でおいくつになられたのかし？
何急に。
いいから教えてくださらない？
母は、多分。
この子の名前は？
Kazuki grabbed my arm and pulled me over.
名字を教えてくれる？スオーよ。だいぶ疲れが溜まっているみたいね。無理もないわ。私たちがここへ来て今日で何日目だったかしら？考えるのが面倒になった？でも考えて。今日は何日目？あらびっくり。ウェルニッケ脳症かしら。
Smiling brightly, Kazuki leaned over and softly whispered into my ear.
今から言うことをメモして。
I hastily brought my pen to my notepad. Chronic Wernicke's encephalopathy. Signs of severe memory loss. Serious vitamin B1 deficiency. We knew it was a vitamin deficiency. We knew it had grown serious, but that diagnosis wasn't much good to us. We didn't have any needles, and more importantly, we didn't have any dietary supplements to fill them with. Of course, a dietetic regimen with lots of pork, liver, and milk could have done the job just as well, but we didn't have enough food to satisfy even our basic caloric requirements. The only thing we could do for Ibuki was give her an encouraging thump on the shoulder.
耐えろ。
And express the hope her youthful resilience would pull her through. She's losing her memory because she's not healthy right now. None of this was limited to Ibuki Haruna either. The majority of the group was beginning to suffer from vitamin deficiencies. Light fever, joint pains, and shortness of breath were widespread. After our standard round of inspections came to an end, everyone dragged themselves right back to their tents. The morning was unpleasantly cold, and the pervasive sense of physical exhaustion didn't help either. Nobody wanted to wander off into the humid forest, where the chilly fog hung thick as a cloud. By the time we rolled around, the temperature had risen dramatically, and people began to crawl out of their stuffy tents in search of cool air. For another thing, we needed to dry our sleeping bags and mats in the sun, as they'd grown damp from the humid night air and our sweat. Like the others, I pulled the bedding out of our tent, spreading them out on a long, flat rock nearby. Naturally, I took Kazuki's as well. I began to beat the sleeping bags with a tree branch, dust and dead mites flying out in little clouds with every impact. My stomach growled miserably at the exercise. Just as Kazuki declared yesterday, she had begun to add much of her rations to Hiroka's meals. Of course, this was being kept secret from Hiroka-san herself. At this rate, Kazuki wouldn't last long. When I told her I was worried, she laughed off my worries with some cliché about starving samurai making particularly leisurely use of their toothpick, then added that a leader doesn't need to eat, they just need to act like they're eating. The words had given me a bit of a start. It was certainly true that everyone was relying on Kazuki, but I was surprised she'd come to think of herself as a leader. All of a sudden, I heard someone shouting in a clearly angry tone of voice, and my hand stopped in mid-swing. Sound carries well through humid air. The bellowing voice of our team's advisor, Mr. Ochi, reverberated impressively around the rocky valley.
盗んだのは誰だ？俺の荷物から食料を盗んだ者は正直に名乗り出ろ！
I didn't understand the exact details, but apparently someone had stolen food from Mr. Ochi's personal belongings. In the distance, I saw him lifting his rucksack high in the air, his face flushed red with anger. Glancing around the area, I found the others who had left their tents fixedly studying the ground, carefully avoiding eye contact with our teacher. Kaneda-senpai, still focused on scraping out the burnt grains of rice stuck in the corners of her cooker, softly mumbled, "What a joke," without even raising her head.
誰なんだ？今正直に名乗り出れば処分を考えないでもないぞ。
先生の勘違いじゃないんですか？
そんなことはない！
一体何がなくなったと言うんですか？
それは
Mr. Ochi stumbled awkwardly over his words. From the looks of things, the missing food had probably been something he'd hidden away instead of contributing to the common stock.
とにかくこの中の誰かが盗んだのは間違いないんだ。
Even now, his shouts bore the righteous, authoritative tone of a scolding teacher, but we weren't in the classroom. His students responded only with irritated scowls. Of course, I also furrowed my brow at Mr. Ochi's actions. No matter how much he bellowed, it was perfectly obvious the culprit wasn't going to come forward. And in doing so, he was planting the idea of stealing from others in the minds of all the girls who'd been honestly enduring their hunger until now. So if I get hungry, I can just steal food from someone, right? As long as I keep my mouth shut, nobody's going to find out, and it looks like everybody else is doing it anyway. The only thing Mr. Ochi was accomplishing with this tirade was sowing these dangerous thoughts in the back of our minds. When the single carrot went missing from Koide-senpai's tent earlier, Kazuki had skillfully concealed the incident in order to avoid this exact situation. Now it was all for naught. Without a doubt, this problem would reoccur in the future. In order for people to live as human beings, 3 basic rules need to be respected. 1. Don't steal. 2. Don't destroy. 3. Don't kill. 3 broad principles that define the minimum standard of ethical behavior. And in our little community, one of those 3 had just been irrevocably broken. They say that liars often end up as thieves, but the opposite is just as true. When we become thieves, we begin to lie, deceiving and deceived in turn. We snatch the food from each other's mouths. Before long, accusations fly, thefts become brazen, retaliatory, fistfights break out. In the end, some turn to outright violence, attacking others, destroying their property, taking what they want by force. All trust is lost. If things were to reach that stage, it would all be over. None of us would survive. We would destroy ourselves over scraps of food. Kazuki had anticipated this outcome from the very beginning. That afternoon, I was in the forest with Kazuki, gathering edible plants, brooding on the morning's events. I'd long since lost track of how many times I'd asked her the question on my tongue, but I couldn't help myself.
ねえ和樹、私たちこれからどうなるのかな。
14回目。あなたがその質問を私にした回数。
いちいち数えてるの？
この質問何回目だっけと聞かれたら答えてあげようと思って。
And Kazuki's reply too was the same repetitive phrase as always. What will be, there's no way to know how this will end. She certainly seemed fond of it, but to be honest, I'd always thought it was a bit of a non-answer. Certainly didn't make me feel much better.
越智先生は明日ここを出ていくそうよ。
出ていくってどうして？
数日かけて周辺を調べて、なんとか下山できそうな目処が立ったそうよ。
Apparently, having finally decided just yesterday to leave and get help, Mr. Ochi had been preparing for his departure this morning. During this process, he noted the hidden food had gone missing from his rucksack.
先生が隠し持っていたのは合宿の夜にこっそりと楽しんでいた晩酌でビールのつまみにと用意していたミニサラミだったらしいわね。
サラミか。
An Italian sausage, ground pork, seasoned with spices and cured by drying. Preserved food like that would make for ideal rations, as it doesn't go bad easily. You could slice it up thinly and drop it on pizza, or maybe mince it and mix it into a big plate of pasta. Just imagining the spicy, salty taste left my mouth overflowing with drool.
誰が取ったのかな。
それは重要な問題じゃないわ。越智先生としては誰も名乗り出なかったのがショックだったみたいね。もう限界だって泣きそうな顔をしていたわ。
そっか。
From the beginning, Mr. Ochi said he wasn't really cut out for this job. As for why, apparently he simply had a hard time dealing with women in general. Given that his job involved quarreling girls at the most emotional stage of adolescence, he found the experience immensely nerve-wracking at the best of times. And now, of all things, he was living under terrible conditions with a pack of desperate girls, increasingly crushed under the pressure of their excessive expectations. Really, it was hardly surprising he'd want to make a break for it as soon as humanly possible.
先生がいなくなったら私たちどうなるんだろう。
こういう言い方は先生に対して甚だ失礼だとは思うけれど、体制に影響はないと思うわよ。
To be sure, Mr. Ochi was never exactly a powerful presence. Even during our normal team activities, I'd always thought of him as more of a cushion between the official authority of the school and the day-to-day management, which was almost entirely handled by our team captain. Still, we had more faith in him than that might suggest. He was an adult with a legal responsibility to us, and as a man he was better physically equipped to handle certain jobs. His presence here had been subtly reassuring in its way, allowing us to slip back into the comfortingly passive role of students. And while he wasn't much for stopping our fights, the fact that a teacher was watching acted as a significant check on our behavior. If Mr. Ochi were to leave the camp tomorrow, we'd lose our only real authority figure. Wasn't there a chance his departure could become the spark that would set off a descent into something uglier?
不安だよ和樹。
大丈夫よ。もしもの時は私があなたを守ってあげるから。ね。
You'd think she was an elder sister calming a frightened younger sibling. Her words were immensely reassuring, but also inspired something very close to shame. It felt as though I'd just forced another responsibility onto Kazuki's overburdened shoulders out of nothing more than pathetic weakness. My face crumpled bitterly, and I could feel tears building behind my eyes.
もしもの時って？
もしもの時はもしもの時。多くは想定外の好ましくない事態に遭遇した状況を指してそう呼びます。
これ以上まだ状況が悪くなるってこと？
まあなるでしょうね。でも心配はいらないわ。もしも何かを犠牲にしなければあなたを守れないという状況になったら、私は全てを犠牲にしてでもあなたを守るから、全然大丈夫。愛してるわ、アマネ。
嬉しいけど大丈夫だよ。私自分の身は自分で守るから。
あら本当？実は私も自分のことで精一杯な部分もあって、そうしてもらえるとすごく助かるわ。
Kazuki was just affirming my own words, but for some reason it felt like she was abandoning me. All of a sudden, there was a dull pain in my chest.
大丈夫よ。アマネは強い子だから。ね。
That's right. I can't let myself stay dependent on Kazuki forever. I wanted her words to be true. I wanted to be strong. Strong enough to help her. Strong enough to protect her. Strong enough to be necessary to her. If I couldn't be strong now, I had the feeling I'd be weak forever, always hiding behind the protection of others, helpless and worthless until the end of my days. I'll go a little further. The 9th day in the valley, the morning of Mr. Ochi's departure from the camp was unfortunately a rainy one.
先生、どうかお気をつけて。
With the exception of the mobile Hirokusu, everyone gathered in the drizzling rain to see our teacher off. Mr. Ochi stood before us, a heavy rucksack on his back, impassive to the water running down his glasses. It felt as though I was looking at a young officer about to head off for the front lines. As a matter of fact, there had been some vaguely sarcastic jokes yesterday about making him one of those 1,000-stitch belt good luck charms that Imperial soldiers used to take to war. But no matter how unreliable Mr. Ochi had been as a teacher, everyone quietly recognized that he was now our only visible glimmer of hope. 10 members of the basketball team had survived the fall. Our belt would have come up a good 990 stitches short. Not to say that we sent him off completely empty-handed, although our gift was less sentimental and more practical. When the rain began to fall this morning, we hastily cut apart trash bags to create a makeshift poncho. These had been a virtual necessity on rainy days, especially before we constructed the toilet, so we had the hang of making them by this point. The poncho offered some protection from the rain while allowing free use of both arms. For a short time, at least, it would keep out the wet and prevent your body temperature from falling too dramatically. That said, in the end, it was a pretty flimsy thing. And on a cosmetic level, it was not only distinctively ugly, it made an irritating rustling sound every time you took a step. Nonetheless, Mr. Ochi accepted it with a sincerely grateful "thank you."
では行くよ。必ず助けを呼んでくる。それまでなんとか生き延びてくれ。
Bye.